and welcome to another video. I'm Random, and today I'm going to be reading the fanfiction Alternate Perspectives from the Fallen Star series, written by Boxmaker. This is a Hermitcraft SMP fanfiction with a rating of mature, and the creator chose not to use any archive warnings, though personally I'd put in graphic depictions of violence for a few scenes. The category for this fic is General, and the featured characters are Etho-slab, Vintage Beef, BOO, DocM77, Good Times with Scar, Cubfan135, Iscal85, and other original characters. There are no romantic relationships, but the featured platonic relationships are Etho-slab and Vintage Beef, BOO, Etho-slab and Vintage Beef, Cubfan135, and Good Times with Scar. The additional tags are superpowers, alternate universe superheroes/superpowers, injury, blood and injury, hijinks and shenanigans, drinking, heist, hurt comfort, non-consensual body modification, Etho-centric, oops, I gave him trauma, kidnapping, medical torture, needles. Don't worry, he'll be mostly okay in the long run. These tags make it seem dark, but I promise this is lighthearted. The summary is in the description, and now on to the story. Chapter 1. Construction Area. Keep out. Naturally, it was pouring rain while Etho was trying to walk home. It fell in sheets so thick he could barely see the sidewalk in front of him. He had forgone his rain jacket in favor of wrapping it over his backpack to protect his laptop from getting wet. But at this point, it was probably futile. The bad weather wasn't making his day any better. He was still fuming over the points Doc had taken off his last assignment. He had missed some important documentation in his code, sure, but 5 points? Really, Doc? He held a decent review sessions, but he was a harsh grader. On top of that, he still had a project to work on, and exams were looming in the distance. Best not to think about it right now. College was rough, and computer science wasn't exactly the easiest of majors, but he was steadily getting through. At least he didn't have— Fuck! He tripped over an uneven patch of ground that he couldn't see, and nearly tipped headfirst into the street. That could have been bad, but at least there weren't many cars out on the road. The ones parked on the side of the street were in danger of getting washed away, and he doubted many people were willing to risk the danger of getting into a crash. He stumbled across the street when he saw the light switch from red to green through the rainy haze. His socks and shoes were already soaked, so he didn't bother trying to avoid the puddles on his way. Luckily, he had to walk this path through the city every day to get from his apartment to the campus, so he knew the route, even if he couldn't see very well. A few people brushed past him, but there weren't many out and about during the monsoon. Etho came upon the final intersection and muttered a curse. The street was completely flooded, and while it wasn't deep, there was a slight incline and the water was rushing fast enough that the road would be a struggle to cross. Etho stood on the sidewalk and debated his options for a moment. He could brave the street, but if he fell over, he was going to land in a pool of water that probably contained every disease known to man, thanks to the city sewers. If he didn't cross, he would have to find another route, and traveling half-blind was already hard enough. He sighed and turned away from the street, making his way up the block. He was already soaked, and he liked not wading through sewer water. The area was slightly less familiar, but Etho still recognized the shops and cafes that lined the side of the road. For a moment, he considered ducking into a shop and waiting out the rain, but sitting in the air conditioning while soaking wet sounded like a poor choice. Then again, they might not let him in at all since he would just drip all over the floor. He passed a few construction signs, but didn't pay them any mind. There was always some construction going on in this part of town that never seemed to get finished, no matter how much work got done to it. It had gotten dark faster than Etho thought it would, and he watched the street lamps flicker to life around him. He was doubly blinded by the rain and lack of light now, but he was almost home. Etho's first mistake was not paying attention to the construction signs and caution tape. His second mistake was not keeping his eyes on the uneven ground in front of him. He took a step but found there was no ground beneath him, and with a strangled cry, he fell forward, tearing right through a flimsy strip of caution tape. He half rolled, half slid down the side of a rocky, muddy pit. He feebly tried to grab onto anything to slow his fall, but his hands were met with nothing but open air. The ground came up to meet him quickly, and he gasped as his shoulder collided with the ground. As he laid sprawled out in the pit, dark spots danced in his vision, or maybe that was just the rain hitting his head. His head spun and throbbed as he lay there, trying to catch his breath. His entire body hurt. His eyes focused on what he thought were stars in the sky, but turned out to be the lights in the buildings around him. He was face up, backpack still on his back, weighing him down like a turtle that had been flipped over in its shell. He was glad to see no one was around to witness his predicament, because he probably looked incredibly stupid. He was also sopping wet, covered in mud and scattered with scrapes and bruises. It was not his finest moment. Etho hissed as he tried to wiggle his left shoulder out of the strap. It had hit the ground first and now throbbed painfully with every movement. Head still spinning. That was normal, right? He fished around the pockets of his cargo pants for his phone. The screen was already covered with cracks, so it was difficult to tell if it had sustained any further damage. It was waterproof enough for the rain to not be an immediate issue, and he squinted as he scrolled for Beef's contact. The screen was incredibly bright and blurry, and his head hurt even more just looking at it. His finger hovered over a name that looked vaguely like Beef's, but that B could very easily be a D, and no matter how hard he squinted, he couldn't tell. Before he could click the call button, the screen went dark without warning. No. Of all the days for his phone to die on him, of course it had to be today. No, shit, come on, he muttered, frantically tapping the screen. The phone didn't turn back on. Etho yelled angrily and rubbed his eyes, which jostled his injured shoulder, which made him yell even louder. He panted and wiped the water from his face. The rain was doing a fantastic job of masking his frustrated tears. Resolving to free himself, he gently slid over to the side as far as the straps of the bag would allow him and managed to free his mostly uninjured right arm. From there, he was able to worm his left arm free with minimal issue. He sat up and the world tilted violently. Shutting his eyes and breathing deeply to quell the nausea, he cradled his injured arm, trying not to jostle the shoulder too much. He wasn't sure how bad the damage was, but it was probably best to keep it still for now. He had several problems. He was injured and trapped in a muddy hole. It wasn't as deep as he initially thought, only about 6 feet or so, but the sides were slippery and wet, and he doubted he could pull himself out with only one arm, even if it wasn't raining. His backpack was still in the mud and had sunk in several inches after having his entire weight on top of it. He would have to carry it over one shoulder, and it would only be more of a challenge to pull himself out of the pit if he was weighed down. Etho took stock of the rest of his injuries. Aside from the throbbing shoulder, he was littered with various cuts and bruises from his fall down, but they wouldn't pose too much of an issue. His head also pounded, and by his best guess, he probably had a concussion. How did one treat a concussion again? Were you meant to sleep or not? He couldn't remember. And was that why he was dizzy, or was there another reason? Etho wanted nothing more than to flop back into the mud, close his eyes, and let the rain wash him away. But he also really wanted to go home. He rose to his knees carefully and stood, trying to maintain balance to avoid falling back in the mud. His body screamed at him and he wobbled, but managed to stand successfully. The mud was difficult to wade through and the rain was still coming down hard, but he gingerly stepped over to his bag and tugged it out of the mud. It was heavy on his good shoulder, but there wasn't much he could do about that. The construction pit was larger than he initially thought, and scattered with big pieces of machinery. He eyed the split caution tape where he fell in. They really needed to invest in some more signs. Etho waded through the mud over to an impressive-looking bulldozer. It was even more intimidating to look at it from the ground where it towered over him. Next to it was a drenched traffic cone. He was already trespassing, so surely there was no harm in adding theft to the list as well. He hefted the cone under his good arm and continued on. He didn't have to walk far before the ground started to slope upwards. The hill was muddy and treacherous, but he planted the cone in the ground and used it as the world's worst makeshift cane as he waded uphill. It took him a while to reach the top, but finally he reached solid ground. Etho tossed the cone ahead of him to safety and stumbled up after it. He fell to his knees and cheered quietly, reveling in victory. If anyone passed him right now, they would be greeted with a 20-something-year-old college student covered in mud, cackling with glee. Hopped up on adrenaline, Etho's body felt much better for the time being, as he shifted the bag slung over his shoulder and picked up the end of the traffic cone, dragging it behind him. They had been through too much together for him to abandon it now. He felt a bit maniacal, body shaking in the cold rain as he dragged the cone down the street. He reached his building after a few minutes of stumbling along the sidewalk. The building was tall and nondescript, but the windows were brightly lit with LED lights and colored flags, making it an obvious home to many college students. It was getting hard to walk straight now, and his arm was really starting to hurt. There was a pressure building directly behind his eyes that he couldn't get rid of, which was starting to make keeping his eyes open a chore. Etho briefly considered using the front door, but the lady at the front desk was already on his case after the ladder incident, and he really didn't want to further piss her off by tracking mud through the lobby. He circled the building instead, heading to the alleyway. The first level of the fire escape platform was just over his head, and he was usually able to jump up, grab the lowest ledge, and pull himself up, but there was no way he was going to be able to do that in his current state. There was a ladder attached to the side of the stairwell. It was raised, but if he could knock it down, he could probably climb it. He eyed the cone, tugging on it to feel out its weight. He dropped his bag and gently moved his left arm forward and back a little bit, testing his range of motion. It still hurt, but it wasn't screaming in pain from the small movement, so Etho picked up the cone in both hands, supporting most of its weight on his good arm, and with a yell, he hurled the cone as far as he could up towards the ladder. His arm screamed with the sudden motion, and Etho winced as he watched the cone fly straight past the ladder, missing it by a solid amount. Fuck. It took him more tries than he was willing to admit to get the ladder down, and by the time he did, his arm was throbbing with pain once again. He shut his eyes and leaned back against the wall, trying to will away the stabbing sensation behind them. He was pretty sure his laptop could take the hit, so he swung his bag up onto the landing above him, and it collided with a metallic bang. The cone followed next, looking slightly more dented than it had previously been. Etho tucked his left arm close to his chest and gingerly climbed the ladder one-handed. If he could do it drunk, he could do it one-handed. At least, that's what he whispered to himself over and over as he made his way up. It was slippery and his vision had gone blurry, but at least he reached the first landing of the fire escape. For the second time that day, he found himself lying on his back, panting in the rain. Dragging himself to his feet, Etho grabbed his belongings, and the thought of a warm meal and dry change of clothes motivated him to begin the final stretch of his journey home. He dragged the cone behind him, and it made a clanking sound as it hit every single step. Everyone on this side of the building could definitely hear him, but he wasn't really in the mood to care. At the very least, the rain meant that there was no one hanging out on the fire escape. The 7th floor had never felt further away, but he had never been so relieved to be home. Etho did his best to wipe the mud off his shoes because Beef would kill him if he tracked the mess into the house. It seemed that the rain had already done most of the work for him, so he wrung out his shirt and pulled the window open. He shoved the cone in first and his bag next. Then he wrenched the window the rest of the way open and was met with the delightful smell of Beef's cooking. Whatever it was, it smelled heavenly. Beef's muffled yell reached him through the kitchen. "Etho, why are you coming in that way? It's raining, you know." A pot clattered, and he smiled fondly as he heard Beef's muffled cursing. He pulled himself in the rest of the way through the window and managed to avoid stepping on the plants that occupied the table under the window. It was an impressive collection maintained by the two of them with varying levels of success. The rest of the room was occupied by a beaten-up couch, a coffee table littered with plates, mugs, and a few game controllers, and a cheap TV sitting on a half-broken shelf. The place was small, but it was home. Etho heard Beef rounding the corner, so he wiped the water from his face and hair in an attempt to clean himself up. It was not at all effective. It's raining really hard, and you're gonna... Beef rounded the corner and stopped dead in his tracks. What the hell? He said, taking in Etho, who was wet and covered in mud. Etho gestured to the traffic cone on the ground. Cone, he said, without preamble. His head was on fire, and it was getting hard to think. What the hell happened? Are you alright? Beef asked, approaching Etho and wiping the hair from his face. Beef got blurrier as he approached, so Etho leaned back a slight bit so he could still see. Oh, we've got to get you out of these wet clothes. Beef moved to start pulling off Etho's jacket, then paused and pointed towards the hallway. Actually, get in the shower. You're tracking mud everywhere, and I gotta turn off the stove. It took Etho a few seconds to register Beef's instructions, and by the time he had started making his way to the bathroom, Beef was right behind him. He was muttering curses about the mud, but didn't seem overly surprised at Etho's current state. He was used to the shenanigans after years of friendship. Etho wrenched back the shower curtain with his good arm and unceremoniously plopped himself in the shower, leaning against the cool tile wall. Etho! Etho snapped his eyes open to see Beef's hand waving in front of his face. Dude, what the hell happened? Did you roll around in the muddy puddle or what? It was something like that, Etho replied, exhausted. Beef leaned in close and tilted his chin up, peering into his eyes. Did you fall or something? He asked. Not very far, Etho muttered, shifting uncomfortably. It was a lot colder on the bathroom floor, and he was still sopping wet. You have a concussion, Beef said flatly. Etho stared at him blankly for a few seconds. No, he said finally, batting Beef's hand away. He didn't want to stress Beef out more than he already was. Your pupils are the size of dinner plates, Etho. You alternate between squinting at me or staring at me like a deer in the headlights, Beef said exasperatedly. No concussion, my ass, he murmured, turning the shower on swiftly. The cold shock of water startled Etho out of his half-asleep state. He was cold before, but now it was downright freezing. He garbled something unintelligible and pushed himself backwards where the water wasn't hitting him dead on. A little warning next time, please, he muttered, giving a death stare to Beef, who was busy rooting through the cabinet under the sink. It'll warm up. I'm going to get you a change of clothes. Are you capable of rinsing off without giving yourself a second concussion? Yep, he replied, rising to shaky feet. He tugged the shower curtain shut as Beef left and turned the water on to its hottest temperature. At best, it would probably get lukewarm. The hot water in the building was rarely hot at all. Etho shook his jacket off, taking care not to jostle round his arm, but still winced in pain the entire time. The rest of his clothes followed, and he left them in a muddy pile on the shower floor. The shower was already dirty anyways. Beef returned with his clothes and then left, muttering something about dinner. With the mud washed off, Etho felt more or less human again. He carefully stepped out of the shower so he didn't slip and crack his head open again, and nearly did a double take as he looked in the mirror. His left shoulder already had a nasty-looking bruise, and the rest of him was covered in small cuts and blemishes. He dressed quickly, thankful that Beef had brought him long pants and a sweatshirt to cover up the marks. He wasn't against telling Beef what happened, but he just knew that Beef would worry about him, and then he would start stress cooking, fussing over him, and buying more plants, which he did whenever he needed to take his mind off things. Etho didn't want to become the reason the table holding their plants collapsed, so he decided that Beef didn't need to know the finer details of what happened. With a deep breath, he closed his eyes and steadied himself. His whole body hurt. His head felt like it was going to explode, but he was home. He was safe. Etho opened his eyes and yelled in surprise. He was looking down at himself from behind, almost like he was playing a video game from a third-person perspective. He blinked, and as quickly as it had started, his vision snapped back to normal. He turned in a circle, shaking. What the hell? What the fuck? Was he hallucinating now too? He rubbed his eyes. The concussion was getting to him. He probably just needed rest. Etho nodded to himself. He had a concussion, and it had been a long day. Nothing was wrong. Everything was perfectly normal. He couldn't quite convince himself, but he left the bathroom quickly before he lost a nerve. Beef swung into the hallway, nearly colliding with him. Whoa, hey, I heard yelling. Are you good? Etho hesitated. He hated lying to his best friend, but he didn't want Beef thinking he had lost it. I'm fine. It was just a spider. Beef raised his eyebrows, clearly not fully believing him, but didn't press the issue. Etho was led to the living room, and he promptly collapsed on the couch. Do you want dinner? Etho started to shake his head, but that made him dizzy, so he mumbled a no. Then he grabbed his backpack, which had landed on the ground in front of the couch after he tossed it in. The traffic cone was still lying on its side in the middle of the living room. He pulled out his laptop, which was completely dry thanks to the raincoat he had wrapped around the bag. It probably wouldn't have mattered. He could drop it off a building and it would still turn on fine. It was almost certainly dead though, given the battery life sucked, so he set it aside. Digging around some more, he found what he was looking for and then capped the bottle of painkillers with a hum. Etho popped 2 into his mouth and then swallowed them dry just as Beef came in carrying a plate of pasta. He was scrolling through his phone with a frown on his face. Is something wrong? He asked Beef. Sorry, just looking up what to do when your idiot roommate has a concussion, he replied, concern edging his voice. It's fine, I'll just sleep it off. This says that I should wake you up every few hours just in case, Beef informed him. Etho groaned and covered his face with a pillow. Please don't, he begged. Beef continued like he hadn't heard Etho. Are you still good for tomorrow? Hell, are you even going to be able to make it to class? Etho squinted at him through half-closed eyes. He had almost forgotten about the fair tomorrow. It was something that happened every year, where the mayor of the city gave a speech and there would be food and carnival games, and he had promised Beef they would go together a few weeks back. You should be fine. I'm going to crush you when we play ring toss, by the way. Beef huffed, but didn't rise to the bait. Go get some sleep then. In your current state, you probably couldn't find your way out of a cardboard box. Etho rose to his feet lazily. The painkillers were kicking in a bit, so he was feeling better. Man, I had so much I wanted to do today. I've got a project to do. No, Beef said exasperatedly. If I catch you working on something instead of sleeping, that concussion is going to be the least of your problems. Etho snickered. Okay, Mom, he said as he sauntered into the hallway. He was too tired to hear Beef's response. He stumbled into his room, and the moment his head hit the pillow, he was out like a light. Hello, sorry if this is a bit quiet. It is 2 a.m. for me right now, and I don't want to wake anyone up. I love the way that, Box writes Beef and Etho. Their dynamic is just so great. It is so fun to read. I love all of the Fawn Star series, really. I love that I can do this and share it with people like this. I don't really know. I feel like this is cheesy. This is what I get for recording at 2 in the fucking morning. That's all I have to say. This story was written by Boxmaker on Archive of Our Own. The fan art and a few of the sound effects aren't mine. Proper credits for them are in the description. All proper credits are in the description, really. I hope you liked listening to this chapter as much as I liked making it. If you guys could give me some feedback on what you thought, especially on the sound effects. Should I add more? Should I add less? Should I have none? Anything like that. And yeah, that's it. Please like and subscribe and comment and all that. And leave kudos for those listeners on AO3. I hope you liked this chapter. I loved making it. I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.